In the last video, we learned how to look at an angle and find its reference angle. Now we'll use those reference angles to find the trig function evaluated at those angles. So in using a reference angle to evaluate the trigonometric function for an angle, the first thing that we do is we find the reference angle, and then we look at what quadrant the original angle is in. So if we're going to find the sine of 315 degrees, then the first thing that we do is find the reference angle for 315 degrees. So let's go ahead and sketch the angle. 315 degrees is under 360 degrees by 45 degrees. So we know that the sine of 45 degrees is the square root of 2 over 2. Now, you'll notice that our angle is in quadrant 4, and so the sine of 315 degrees is going to be square root of 2 over 2, but because we're in quadrant 4, 315 degrees yields a sine that is negative. Now let's look at cosine of 4 pi over 3. You may want to take 4 pi over 3 and look at 4/3, and that is 1 1/3. So as we go to sketch our angle 4 pi over 3, to figure out what quadrant this is in, we have 1 pi, and then we have 1/3 of a pi, which is under a half. So we are in quadrant 3. The reference angle is pi over 3, and we know that the cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. So therefore, as we look at the cosine of 4 pi over 3, this will be 1/2, and we're in the third quadrant where cosine is negative. So let's recap this. The 1/2 value comes from the value of cosine evaluated for the reference angle. So cosine of pi over 3 was 1/2. Why is it negative? Because 4 pi over 3 is in the third quadrant where cosine is negative. Let's look now at 11 pi over 3 and its sine. So what's 11 pi over 3? 11/3 is 3 2/3. So let's sketch this to determine the quadrant. 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, and then 2/3 is past a half. So this is in quadrant 4. And we know that the reference angle for 11 pi over 3 is pi over 3. The sine of pi over 3 is square root of 3 over 2. So as we look at the sine of 11 pi over 3, it will have that same magnitude, square root of 3 over 2, and we just have to determine whether it's positive or negative. Because sine is negative in the fourth quadrant, we have negative square root of 3 over 2. Let's look at tangent of 5 pi over 4. So strip 5 pi over 4 of the pi just to look at the fractional form, and this is 1 1/4. So as we sketch it, we have 1 pi, then we have 1/4 of a pi, which is not a half. So we have a third quadrant angle. So the tangent of, now what's our reference angle? Our reference angle is pi over 4. Tangent of pi over 4 is 1. So what's the tangent of 5 pi over 4? It's going to be 1, and now is it positive or negative? In the third quadrant, tangent is positive, so our answer is just 1. So let's look at secant of 3 pi over 4. So we're just looking at 3/4. So that's not 1, and it's past a half. So that lands us in the second quadrant. With a reference angle of pi over 4. So we know the secant of pi over 4. Well, what's the cosine of pi over 4? Cosine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. So secant of pi over 4 is the reciprocal of that, square root of 2. So as we look at the secant of 3 pi over 4, we'll have square root of 2, and then in the second quadrant, secant of 3 pi over 4 will have the same sign, positive or negative, as cosine of 3 pi over 4. Cosine of theta is negative in the second quadrant, so secant of 3 pi over 4 will be negative also. So negative square root of 2 over 2. So let's look at the cotangent of negative 135 degrees. So this will be measured clockwise, and we don't hit 180 degrees clockwise. We have 90 degrees, and then we have another 45 degrees. So if this is negative 180 degrees, then what's the remaining portion here? This magnitude is 45 degrees for a reference angle. So the reference angle is 45 degrees, and we're in quadrant 3. So we know that cotangent of 45 degrees is 1, because the tangent of 45 degrees is 1. So its reciprocal should be 1 as well. Now, what is the cotangent of negative 135 degrees? It will have the same magnitude, 1, and is cotangent of theta positive or negative in the third quadrant? It's positive. So therefore, our answer is just 1. Let's look at the secant of 150 degrees. Here again, we are measuring counterclockwise, but we don't make it to 180 degrees. We are 30 degrees shy. So the reference angle is 30 degrees, and this is in quadrant 2. So secant of 30 degrees is what? Well, maybe a little scratch work off to the side will be helpful. Cosine of 30 degrees is the square root of 3 over 2. So secant of 30 degrees is 2 over the square root of 3, which is 2 square roots of 3 over 3, if we rationalize the denominator. So we have secant of 150 degrees will be 2 square roots of 3 over 3, and is secant of 150 degrees positive or negative? And since we're in quadrant 2, well, cosine of theta and secant of theta are both negative. in quadrant 2. So our answer is negative 2 square roots of 3 over 3.